By the end of this video, you will know all of the wide receivers that could theoretically be the wide receiver one. We're going to look at the wide receiver one from each of the past 5 seasons and get an average targets per game, receptions, yards, and touchdowns necessary to be the wide receiver one, as well as the low mark in any one of these individual categories that any of the past 5 wide receiver ones had. So when we take a look at the past 5 wide receiver ones, we have Michael Thomas, Davante Adams, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Ceedee Lamb. When we look at Michael Thomas's 2019 season, he finished first in targets, receptions, and yards, while finishing third in total touchdowns with 11.5 targets per game. So Davante Adams finished fourth in targets, second in receptions, fourth in yards, and first in touchdowns, while averaging 10.6 targets per game. Then Cooper Kupp finished first in targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns while averaging 11.2 targets per game. Justin Jefferson finished first in targets, receptions, and yards while finishing 8th in touchdowns with 10.8 targets per game. And Ceedee Lamb finished first in targets, receptions, and yards while finishing 3rd in touchdowns with 10.6 targets per game. So when we look at the targets, for instance, every one of these wide receivers besides Davante Adams finished first in targets. So when we think about wide receivers that could be the wide receiver one, that is going to be very, very important. Then when we look at receptions, every one of these wide receivers finished number 1 besides Davante Adams. So you're generally going to need to lead the league in receptions as well. Then when we look at yards, every one of these wide receivers, except for once again Davante Adams, finished first in yards as well. Then when we look at touchdowns, it's a mixed bag. Adams and Kupp finished first in touchdowns, while Thomas finished 3rd, Ceedee finished in 3rd place, and Justin Jefferson finished in 8th place. So the correlation with touchdowns isn't necessarily as important. It's looking like targets, receptions, and yards dominate this list. And Davante Adams' season was greatly boosted by the fact that he had 18 touchdowns that season. Then when we look at the individual stats that are the lowest among qualifying wide receivers here, every one of these wide receivers had at least 149 targets, 115 receptions, 1,374 yards, and 8 touchdowns while averaging 10.6 points per game. Then the average stats among all of these wide receivers was 176 targets for 134 receptions, 1,720 yards, and 12 touchdowns while averaging 10.9 targets per game. So we're going to take a look at wide receivers who could theoretically hit all of these benchmarks. So just to give you a visual, over the past 5 seasons, the wide receiver one averaged 176 targets for 134 receptions, 1,720 yards, and 12 touchdowns. Let's take a look at who I suspect could reach each one of these benchmarks and finish ultimately as the wide receiver one. So the first wide receiver on this list is Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Ceedee Lamb. So this past season, he finished as the wide receiver one overall, while averaging 23.7 fantasy points per game. When we think about his situation, his quarterback in Dak Prescott is an above-average quarterback, so that's going to help him out, as well as his target competition is below average. Really, Jake Ferguson and Brandon Cooks are the main target competition, so once again, he's going to dominate in targets. When we look at his fantasy points per game throughout his career, in his rookie season, he had 13.6, which was good for 33rd. Then he stepped up to 14.6 in his second season, which was good for 18th. And in his third season, his 17.7 were good for 7th, before becoming the wide receiver one with 23.7 this past season. So Ceedee Lamb is 6'2" at 198 pounds, and he's 25.3 years old. One thing to note is the age apex of wide receiver production is generally age 26, so statistically, he might even have a better season than he did this past year. When we look at his workout metrics, his 4.50 40-yard dash is in the 69th percentile, and his 97.9 speed score is in the 66th percentile, with his 120.7 burst score, which is in the 46th percentile, and his 10.08 catch radius is in the 65th percentile. Then his 181 targets were good for 1st, his 29.9% target share was good for 8th, his 29.9 target rate was good for 4th, his 14 total touchdowns were good for 1st, his 31 red zone targets were good for 1st, his target accuracy of 7.5 was good for 6th, his dominator rating, which is his market share of the team's yards and touchdowns, was good for 9th at 35.4%, His target quality rating was 6.09, which was 6th in the NFL. And finally, his catchable target rate of 80.7 was good for 9th in the entire NFL. So when we look at the benchmarks here, the wide receiver ones over the past 5 seasons needed at least 149 targets. Well, he received 181. They averaged 176 targets, so his total targets were above that. Then he needed to hit at least 115 receptions. Well, he had 135 this past season, and the average was 134, so he did exceed that benchmark as well. Then in terms of receiving yards, he needed at least 1,374. Well, his 1,749 were once again above the average of 1,720. And then he needed to have at least 8 touchdowns. He had 14, which was above the average of 12. Then his 10.6 targets were the lowest among all the wide receivers in this group. So Ceedee Lamb finished with the volume and accurate enough targets to finish above the minimum thresholds of targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, while exceeding the average in targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns necessary to finish as the wide receiver 1. When we think about his situation, it is no different this next season, so he absolutely could be the wide receiver 1 once again. So, the second wide receiver on this list is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. He's coming off a wide receiver 2 overall finish with 23.5 fantasy points per game. When we take a look at his career points per game, he's finished with 12.4, 16, 20.5, 15.7, 21.9, 17.4, 20.4, and 23.5 in his career. So this past season was the most in his entire career, which is very impressive. Then when we think about his situation, he does have to contend with Jalen Waddle, who is one of the best, if not potentially the best, secondary wide receivers in the NFL. He is, however, in an incredibly explosive offense, and he is the most explosive wide receiver in the entire NFL. So Tyreek Hill is 5'10", 185, and he is 30.4 years old, so he is a little bit over the wide receiver age apex, but he's also not the traditional wide receiver. He is probably the most explosive wide receiver we've ever seen. When we look at his metrics, his 4.3 40-yard dash is in the 97th percentile, giving him a 100.0 speed score, which is in the 72nd percentile. His 133.4 burst score is in the 94th percentile. His 10.59 agility grade is in the 98th percentile. And his 10.32 catch radius is in the 94th percentile. When we take a look at his stats from this past season, his 171 targets were good for 3rd, his 33.7% target share was good for 1st, and his 36.9% targets per route run rate was good for 1st as well. So number 1 across the board here. Then he finished with 13 touchdowns, which was good for 2nd. He finished with 25 red zone targets, which was good for 3rd. He finished with a 7.6 target accuracy grade, which was good for 5th. A 43.1% dominator rating, which was 1st in the NFL. A 6.09 target quality rating, which was good for 5th. And a 78.4% catchable target rate, which was good for 13th. When we take a look at his 2023 stats, compared to the least amount of any one of these individual statistics necessary to finish as a wide receiver 1, as well as the averages, his 171 targets were above the minimum threshold of 149 and just under the average of 176. Then his receptions of 119 were above the 115 necessary, but under the 134 average. Then his 1,799 yards were above the minimum of 1,374 and above the average of 1,720. So a bit of a mixed bag here in terms of what he did meet, but he did miss one game this season, so I do suspect that his targets at the very least would have met the minimum threshold. It's just that his reception total probably wouldn't have met that threshold, but overall a very, very solid candidate, and his situation is essentially the exact same, so he is a legitimate threat to be the number 1 wide receiver this season. So the next wide receiver on this list is Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. This past season, he was the wide receiver 3, while finishing with 20.7 fantasy points per game. When we take a look at his career totals in fantasy points per game, in his rookie season, his 13.4 was good for 26th, then he stepped it up to 16.7, which is good for 10th, before finally finishing with 20.7 this past season, which was good for 4th in fantasy points per game. When we take a look at his situation, he is easily going to be the number one target. He does, however, have to contend with Sam Laporta, the tight end, as well as a very, very strong run game with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. So I do potentially worry about his target totals, but overall, he has improved every single season. So there is a realistic chance that he could meet these minimum thresholds and finish as the wide receiver 1 this next season. So when we take a look at Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's 5'11", 197, and he's 24.8 years old. He's generally used in the slot, but he can be a flanker or X wide receiver. And he is under the age apex of 26, so he should be getting better historically at least. Then when we look at his metrics, once again, he's a slot receiver. So his 4.66 speed is in the 14th percentile. His 81.3 speed score is in the 15th percentile. But here's what matters for a slot receiver. His 129 burst score is in the 85th percentile. His 11.16 agility score is in the 61st percentile. And his 9.99 catch radius is in the 47th percentile. So he is bursty and he does have above average agility, and that's how he's going to win with his elite route running. When we look at his targets, his 164 were good for 5th, his 30.2 target share was good for 5th, and his 29.2% targets per route run rate was also good for 5th. So 5th across the board here. Then his 10 touchdowns were also 5th. His 25 red zone targets were good for 3rd. His 7.5 target accuracy rating was good for 8th. His 36.0 dominator rating was good for 6th. His target quality rating of 5.16, however, was good for 38th. And his 76.2 catchable target rate was also good for 23rd. So while he received a lot of the necessary overall volume and important targets in the red zone, the quality rating of his targets was a lot worse than any of the previous 2 wide receivers had. Then when we look at his targets, receptions, yards, and touchdowns, his 164 targets were above the minimum threshold of 149. His 119 receptions were above the minimum threshold as well of 115. His 1,515 yards were above the minimum threshold of 1,374 yards. And his 10 touchdowns were above the minimum threshold of 8. When we look at his targets, his 164 were below the average of 176. His 119 receptions were below the average of 134. His 1,515 yards were below the average of 1,720. And his 10 touchdowns were also below the average of 12. So if he's able to really improve on his stats this next season, he does have a chance. So generally, he does need to improve just a little bit in really all these metrics to hit the average here. But it is within reason, so he definitely is a contender. So the next wide receiver on this list is Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. This past season, he was the wide receiver 11 with 16.4 fantasy points per game. Now, it's important to contextualize this. He did miss one game due to injury, which hurt his overall finish. And then his starting quarterback, Joe Burrow, was hurt for most of the season. So that also hurt his overall finish. When we look at his career points per game, in his rookie season, his 17.9 were good for 5th. Then he stepped it up in a big way to get to 20.2 in his second season, which was good for 4th. Then this past season, once again, due to Joe Burrow being out, his 16.4 was good for 11th. He's still going to be the elite number 1 target in this offense, and his only serious competition is T. Higgins. Ja'Marr Chase is going to eat this season. So Ja'Marr Chase is 6', 201, and he's 24.4 years old, so below the age apex of 26, so he should once again improve. When we take a look at his metrics, his 4.39 40-yard dash is in the 94th percentile. His 106.8 speed score is in the 87th percentile. His 135.7 burst score is in the 97th percentile. His 10.95 agility score is in the 83rd percentile. And his 10.32 catch radius is in the 94th percentile. So this guy is a dominant athlete. When we take a look at his stats from this past season, his 145 targets were good for 11th. His 26.3 target share was good for 14th. And his 24.6 targets per route run rate was good for 24th. His 7 total touchdowns were good for 18th. His 20 red zone targets were good for 8th. His 6.8 target accuracy grade was good for 40th. His dominator rating of 29% was good for 25th. His target quality rating of 5.13 was good for 39th. And his 77.9% catchable target rate was good for 16th. So if he hadn't missed one game and he had Joe Burrow the entire season, I think he would have been much better in every single one of these metrics and would have been much closer to meeting the thresholds necessary for him to be possibly the wide receiver 1 overall. So when we take a look at his overall stats versus the minimum thresholds, his 145 targets was below the 149 minimum, but he did miss a game. So if he had played, I think he would have met that one. Then his 1,216 yards are below the 1,374 minimum. So if he had played an extra game, maybe. And his 7 touchdowns were below the minimum threshold of 8. But if he had had Joe Burrow there and played an extra game, there's a very good chance he finished with over 8. Then when we take a look at his stats versus the average to be the number 1 wide receiver, his 145 targets are definitely below the 176 average. Probably wasn't meeting that. His 100 receptions were well below the average of 134, so he definitely would need to improve in that regard. His 1,216 yards is well below the 1,720 necessary. But once again, with Joe Burrow there's a chance that he would have finished with many more yards. And his 7 touchdowns is well below the average of 12. But to be fair to him, in his rookie season, he did have 13. So I do believe that he could be the wide receiver 1 overall. He just needs to, first of all, play in every game this season. He's only done that once in his 3-year career. And he also needs to have Joe Burrow completely healthy, which has happened twice in 3 years. So there is a chance, and I think that his chance is right around the same as Amon-Ra St. Brown's. So Ja'Marr Chase definitely has the theoretical upside to be the number 1 wide receiver. The next quarterback on this list is Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. This past season, he finished as the wide receiver 33, but he did miss some games with injury. He did finish with 20.2 fantasy points per game, though, which is very, very good. When we look at his rookie season fantasy points per game, his 17.1 were good for 9th. Then in his second season, his 19.4 were good for 4th. Then in his third season, which he finished number 1 overall in, by the way, his 21.7 were good for 2nd. And this past season, his 20.2 were good for 5th. Now, it is important to think about that they lost Kirk Cousins at quarterback. He's going to have Sam Darnold as his quarterback. Rookie first-round pick J.J. McCarthy's out for the season with a meniscus tear. So I would expect it to be a little bit harder for him this season. So Justin Jefferson is 6'1", 202 pounds, and he's 25.2 years old, so below the age apex of age 26. So historically, he still should be getting better. When we look at his metrics, his 4.43 40-yard dash is in the 87th percentile, his 104.9 speed score is in the 84th percentile, his 126.8 burst score is in the 78th percentile, and his 10.06 catch radius is in the 61st percentile. When we take a look at his stats this past season, his 100 targets were good for 35th, his 27.2% target share was good for 13th, and his 27.5 targets per route run rate was good for 11th. Then his 5 total touchdowns were good for 29th, his 10 red zone targets were good for 44th, his 6.6 target accuracy rating was good for 69th, his dominator rating of 30.9% was good for 17th, his target quality rating of 5.89 was good for 12th, and his catchable target rate of 76% was good for 25th. Overall, he's one of the best wide receivers and potentially the best wide receiver in the entire NFL. He missed some time this past season due to injury. He didn't have Kirk Cousins over the second half of the season. So the circumstances aren't working in his favor here for him to be the number 1 wide receiver this season. But he is definitely talented enough. So I'm not going to use his end of season stats here to compare to the minimum thresholds and averages here. I'm going to take a look at a couple seasons throughout his career to see if he's met some of these minimum and average thresholds. So as far as the minimum 149 targets, he's received that in 2 of his 4 seasons. The minimum of 115 receptions has been met once. The minimum of 1,374 yards has been met every season except for this last one, so 3 times. And the minimum threshold of touchdowns has been met in 2 of the past 4 seasons. Now, in terms of seasons in which he's met the average threshold for targets, he's done that once. The average of 134 receptions has never been done yet, but he did have 128 this past season. The average of 1,720 yards has been met once, and the average of 12 touchdowns has never been met one time. So once again, he's definitely a contender here. He's just going to have to be even better than he has been because of the circumstances. So the next wide receiver is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. He's coming off a season in which he was the wide receiver 26 while averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game. So the best quarterback that he's played more than 4 snaps with is Zach Wilson. So he's been in just about the worst, if not the worst, situation possible for a wide receiver. And he's had worse than Zach Wilson. When we take a look at his fantasy points per game as a rookie, his 12.7 was good for 30th. And then it did go down this past season to 12.5, which was good for 32nd. However, he is going to get Aaron Rodgers back this season. So I do expect a huge step up in terms of his production. He's the dominant wide receiver there, and the next best wide receiver is Mike Williams. He's going to be fed early and often, and he's definitely going to meet the target threshold for sure. So Garrett Wilson is 6 foot 184, and he's 24.1 years old, so definitely below the age apex of 26, so he should be getting a lot better. Then when we look at his metrics, his 4.38 40-yard dash is in the 95th percentile, giving him a 98.6 speed score, which is in the 68th percentile, a 122.7 burst score, which is in the 57th percentile, and a 10.01 catch radius, which is in the 52nd percentile. When we look at his targets, his 168 this past season were good for 4th, his 30.1% target share was good for 7th, his 25.2 targets per route run rate was good for 19th, his 3 total touchdowns, however, were only good for 58th, his 19 red zone targets were good for 9th, his 6.4 target accuracy rating was 76th, his 29.3 dominator rating was good for 22nd, his 5.03 target quality rating was good for 48th, and his 67.9% catchable target rate was good for 65th. So overall, it was really just that the accuracy of his targets was atrocious, and a lot of them were uncatchable. Now that Aaron Rodgers is coming back, he's going to receive much better targets, first of all. Then second of all, the offense is going to be much more efficient and is going to score more points, thus really helping him across the board here. Now, in terms of comparing his stats to the minimum thresholds, it is a little bit hard because the situation now is going to be so much better than it has been his entire career. Really, though, when we look at his targets, he definitely could meet the minimum threshold because he was just 2 off that threshold as a rookie, and then he well exceeded that. Now, his receptions did go up from 83 to 95, but he would need to really step that up to get to 115, and especially the average of 134. Then his receiving yards would obviously have to go up to meet the minimum threshold of 1,374 and the average of 1,720, and especially his touchdowns. 4 and 3 is just not going to cut it to be the wide receiver 1 overall. The minimum the past 5 seasons was 8. But to be fair to him, with Aaron Rodgers throwing him the ball, I think he could finish much closer, and I definitely could see him meeting the minimum thresholds. And it's really just projection to think if he might be able to meet the average thresholds here. But he's going to be easily the number 1 target in this offense. Davante Adams has been the number 1 wide receiver before with Aaron Rodgers throwing him the ball. So I do believe that Garrett Wilson is definitely a candidate to be the wide receiver 1 this season. So a couple of wide receivers who I believe it is pretty unlikely, but is possible, are Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. Now, he is coming off a wide receiver 4 finish. However, that was with Cooper Kupp only playing in 12 games, and he was injured at times throughout the season during these games. So I do believe he would need another Cooper Kupp injury and for a good amount of the season to have enough volume and consistency to be the wide receiver 1 overall, but it is possible. Then you have A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. I think he would need an injury to Devontae Smith. They also just traded for Jahan Dotson. Now, Jahan Dotson isn't taking away targets from A.J. Brown. But really, I think he would need an injury to Devontae Smith to finish as a wide receiver 1. Devontae Adams could be the wide receiver 1 this year. It's just that he's going to be receiving passes from Gardner Minshew, at least to begin the season. Now, while Gardner Minshew does like to target the number 1 wide receiver quite often, he's also not the best quarterback. And he also has increased target competition with Brock Bowers there. So the next wide receiver is Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. By the way, he is my dark horse candidate if you watched that video a couple of weeks ago. I do think it's unlikely. He might need a Trey McBride injury, but he's still going to receive north of 150 targets, assuming he plays all 17 games this season. He's the best prospect we've seen in quite some time. He's good at everything he does, and he's going to be the dominant number 1 target for Kyler Murray. Then Malik Neighbors could potentially get there just on raw volume alone. It wouldn't shock me if he gets 170 targets. I do think it's really unlikely because the accuracy of these targets from Daniel Jones is going to be awful. But he will absolutely get the pure volume necessary to potentially finish as the wide receiver 1. But once again, I definitely wouldn't bet any money on that. Then you have Drake London. He is going to have to contend with Kyle Pitts, but this is the Rams scheme, and we've seen what they were able to do with Cooper Kupp. Drake London isn't the same player as Cooper Kupp. He's an X-wide receiver. Cooper Kupp is generally a flanker or slot, but he's still going to be the number 1 target in this offense. I do think he would probably need a Kyle Pitts injury to make that happen, though. So unlikely, but if Kyle Pitts were to go down, Drake London could be the wide receiver 1. He will be fed a ton if that happens. I mean, he's still going to be fed a ton regardless. But overall, I don't think that it's as likely for any of these wide receivers. So once again, one of these polls is going to be used in a video. I asked you, who do you think is going to be the wide receiver 1? And at the point of recording this video, there have been 38 votes. Well, 21% of you said Ceedee Lamb, 13% of you said Justin Jefferson, 21% of you said Tyreek Hill, 32% of you, and the most, said Amon-Ra St. Brown, and 13% of you said other. So, overall, the majority of you think that Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to take a step up and is going to finish as the wide receiver 1 this season. So, my choice is Ceedee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. I think he's going to be the wide receiver 1. When we think about his situation, it's essentially the exact same. He still has Dak Prescott, so he's going to receive very accurate targets. He's still easily the number 1 target. His competition is Brandon Cooks and Jake Ferguson. He's going to be fed a massive amount of targets, and they're going to be good targets. I think he's going to finish as a wide receiver 1 and post a similar season this season as he did this past season. So overall, I gave you a couple of wide receivers that I think are more likely than some of the others to finish as a wide receiver 1 overall, and then gave you a couple of wide receivers that would be contingent on an injury or something else happening for them to finish as a wide receiver 1. But what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Who do you think is going to be the wide receiver 1? Feel free to vote in the poll and comment below. Please remember to like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. I would love to be able to continue doing these videos. Thank you and have a good day.